a reminder to please silence your cell phones, as always. And welcome to the Creation Care panel. Thanks for coming. We have two really great speakers today, and then we're going to leave some time at the end to ask questions. Please keep your questions short and reasonable. And I've also been asked to remind everyone that there's a literature room down a couple rooms here at the end in case anybody has something interesting they want to pick up or leave there for other people to look at. So our first speaker today is Reverend Schneider. He's the rector of the Grace Memorial Episcopal Church, which is here in Portland. He does the annual blessing of the animals every year for St. Francis Sunday, and it was just 2 weekends ago, so recently. He's served on various community boards here in Portland, including schools, legal clinics, and children's centers. And you can also follow him on Twitter, if you so desire. Our next speaker is Daniel Dombrowski. He's a philosophy professor at Seattle University. He has written 16 scholarly books, 4 of which address issues of animal rights. He's also published almost 60 articles, and many of them also discuss animal rights. He's won numerous awards for his research, his writing, and for his teaching, including Favorite Professor for semester at C, one semester. And he has a Wikipedia page, which I discovered when I looked him up. So feel free to ask questions at the end, and thanks for coming.
Thank you. I feel right at home. You might wonder why I would say that, but the fact that the front row is largely empty is very familiar from my particular tradition. I have to say I'm both honored and humbled to be with you here today at this very significant conference and to join my distinguished panelist, Professor Dombrowski. What I bring is a rather limited, although distinct perspective as the pastor of an urban congregation, where we seek to pursue, over the course of our liturgical year, an approach to creation care that includes, in a quite central way, the blessing of animal companions. I join with a growing number of other Christians who see as their task to create a climate of respect for God's creation, which in turn can support emerging law as it contributes to the welfare of animals. My story begins on a Sunday morning in the fall of 1988 while I was studying at an Episcopal seminary in New York City. Upon the suggestion of a friend, I went to the Upper West Side of Manhattan on the first Sunday in October to worship at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where I became part of a congregation of some 3,000 women, men, and children, along with nearly as many non-human animal companions. Everyone had gathered to participate in the annual celebration of the life of St. Francis of Assisi, the most beloved of all the Christian saints, and to share in the blessing of animals. As I sat down, my first sight was seeing in front of me a tail moving back and forth like a metronome. And I discovered, of course, that I had a large white rat that was the occupant of that shoulder. And I knew I was in for a rather different Sunday morning experience. But an intuitive chord was struck on that day, and I was so moved by my experience that for the past 20 years, on the Sunday nearest the 4th of October, the day that Christian churches commemorate the life of St. Francis, I have blessed non-human animals along the way, introducing 2 congregations to what I think is a growing tradition. For me, the practice of animal blessing reflects a fundamental understanding that all animals, we humans among them, are creatures of sacred and intrinsic worth. While in the biblical tradition, blessing may happen in many ways with a variety of beneficiaries, the source of all blessings, human blessings, is generally understood to reside in God. So that what we humans bless, whether it be animals or 2 persons joined together in a sacred union or an entire congregation in a service of worship, God is the source of that blessing extended through a human agent. A blessing is a performative act intended to bring good upon the one being blessed. I'm following this closely and moving sort of fast because we have a time limit here, so that's what's happening. Blessing also reflects a favorable relationship between parties. And growing out of my experience over time with this practice, I've been led to wrestle with a question once voiced by Barbara Allen of Melbourne, Australia, regarded, I think, as the first of the ordained animal hospital chaplains. She asked, what does it actually mean to bless animals, and to recognize and own that we are also blessed by animals? Anyone who seeks an answer to that question has to confront the harsh reality of what has been both the history and the broad cultural legacy of the place of non-human animals in Christian tradition. While Christianity has not spoken with a singular voice over time or even in our own day concerning the treatment of animals, The tragic truth is that across the centuries, Christians, by seeing humans as vastly superior to animals, share a large responsibility for fostering attitudes that have contributed to the large-scale suffering of animals. One recent assessment by Paul Waldrow, I think, who was here last year, writes in an article on religion and animals, Christianity inherited the Hebrew vision that all humans are made in the image of God and have been given dominion over the earth. Early Christians in the formative stages of the tradition also borrowed from the Greek cultural tradition. In important ways, the mainline Christian tradition narrowed the Hebrew side of its heritage by playing down the animal-friendly features of the Hebrews' attitudes, while at the same time foregrounding the anti-animal aspects of the Greeks' vision that were tied to a special evaluation of humans' rationality. Some of the early proponents of Christianity, including Origen and Augustine of Hippo, exaggerated humans' distance from other animals. The result over time was a Christian amalgam in which certain obvious connections to non-human animals were radically subordinated, as when the mainline Christian tradition claimed that humans are so superior to the rest of creation that humans' morality rightfully excludes other animal interests when they are in conflict, even with minor human interess. Many have seen this thinking culminating in the writings of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, who in turn drew upon the work of Aristotle. As Oxford professor Andrew Lindsay, a leading contemporary theologian on the status of animals, puts it, we may summarize Aquinas in this way: considered in themselves, animals have no reason and no rights, and humans no responsibility to them. This position of Aquinas became the dominant Western Christian doctrine on animals ever since the 13th century, and it's retained its influence even into our own day. The position was not seriously challenged until the 18th and 19th centuries, when a variety of forces contributed to an alternative Christian vision about the treatment of animals. Among these forces were humanitarian efforts in the 19th century that addressed, among other issues, the issue of cruelty to animals. Some of the most influential Christians of the time were involved. In England, for example, these included William Wilberforce, noted also for his role in leading the battle in Parliament which abolished the slave trade, Lord Shaftesbury, who also campaigned against the exploitation of children. And there was Arthur Broom, an Anglican clergyman who founded the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1824. Here I might add that my own congregation, Grace Memorial Episcopal Church, which is celebrating its centennial this year, was established through the generous gift of one woman, Angela Berry, recently widowed, and in 1908 she gave a gift to allow us to purchase the property that we're located on. Her other principal interest as a devout Christian was the Oregon Humane Society, where she was a vice president, and she established a prize to be given to school children in Oregon for the best essay on animal life. She also created a fund to cover the expenses of a traveling humane agent for Oregon, whose special duties, to quote from the National Humane Review at the time, will be to look after animals on the plains, the stage, stock horses, and slaughterhouses. I inherited a rich legacy. This leads me to our own day and to what I see as some positive developments in the Christian tradition that encourage adherents to look to non-human animals with both reverence and responsibility. Seen from within the Christian perspective, I want to briefly explore three questions. Questions which, as a parish priest and pastor, I address in my preaching and in my teaching ministry. First, what are some key sources for arriving at an alternative Christian vision regarding animals? Second, what are some directional markers that can become guides for understanding and for action? And finally, what are some of the unresolved issues and challenges we face? First, what are some of the key sources for arriving at an alternative Christian vision regarding the treatment of animals? Christians, at least within the Episcopal or Anglican family of which I'm a part, approach the treatment of non-human animals as they do other questions by drawing upon three, sometimes four sources of authority. These are Scripture, tradition, and reason, with experience often added as a fourth. When it comes to Holy Scripture, we find a re-examining and a reappropriating of some of the defining stories. And I should add images or word pictures as well, that are included in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the Christian Testament and the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels and in the letters. Revisiting stories has become significant for the development of a Christian vision. For in the words of ethicist Alistair MacIntyre, I can only answer the question of what I am to do if I can answer the prior question, what story or stories do I find myself a part? Time only permits a few brief examples. Central among the stories that are being revisited are the stories of creation and covenant, in the book of Genesis. In the first of the creation stories, the familiar 7-day story of creation, cattle, creeping things, the wild animals, along with humankind, were created together on the 6th day of creation. You can see we human animals didn't even get our own day. Not many people realize that. There wasn't a human day in the biblical story of creation. As you can see, we human animals share this single day, and it's brought us together with non-human animals in a special narrative relationship. One aspect of this 6th day of creation story has led to countless harm to God's creatures across the centuries, and it's in the charge to humankind in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, to have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. In the dominant Christian tradition, dominion has often been interpreted in ways that are damaging to the interests of animals. This has led over time to an instrumental view of animals, that we can dominate creation, including non-human animals, to serve our own human interests as a species. In revisiting this story, dominion has come to be understood not as domination, but as loving stewardship, an invitation to join with God in the care of creation. As theologian Kim Fabricius recently wrote, to be human is to be responsible. That is the inner meaning of the dominion of Genesis 1:26, which is a dominion not of domination but of stewardship, taking care of the world's backyard. God, the world maker, is God, the caretaker. Dominion here, as some of you may be interested to note, is granted within a vegan world, where an intriguing feature of the 6 days that both human and non-human animals were given the very same diet. As the text reads, God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." Later in Genesis, in God's covenant with Noah, which follows the story of the flood, humans were allowed a broader diet. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you green plants, I give you everything. While this extension is often seen as a concession to flawed humanity, nevertheless, even this covenant embraced both human and non-human animals in the divine promise, along with a certain symbolic reverence for life. One could only eat animal flesh, but not its life, that is, its blood, or as the text reads, "Only you shall not eat flesh with its life," with its blood. Another passage in the Hebrew Scriptures which has received renewed interest and attention by Christians is the vision of the peaceable kingdom. This vision, often seen in paintings, the Quaker painter Edward Hicks rendered the scene some 60 times. It's a vision that has a story-like quality, and it served an iconic function for many Christians active in the issues of animal welfare and the pursuit of better treatment for animals. Here's how the vision reads in the 11th chapter of the book of Isaiah. "The wolf shall live with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze their young, and their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." Support for this vision has been found in the New Testament, in the letter to the Romans, in a passage which envisions with anticipation and hope the coming fulfillment of God's purpose, represented in the word picture of the whole creation, groaning in labor pains. The image here is of a renewed creation, waiting to be born. Let me now turn to a second source of authority, tradition. This source, the tradition of the church, draws us into many interesting people and questions. While the tradition, as I mentioned earlier, has largely been unfriendly to animals, special attention is now being paid to some of the saints and the theologians who have represented in their lives and in their writings a special regard for animals. First among these, of course, is St. Francis of Assisi, who addressed animals along with other aspects of creation as sister and brother. There were others in the early centuries of the Church, including St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, St. Isaac the Syrian. Here are the words from St. John Chrysostom, writing in the 4th century. "Surely we ought to show kindness and gentleness to animals for many reasons, and chiefly because they are of the same origin as ourselves." The writings and prayers of these early saints, along with a host of others from across the centuries, are now being incorporated in new religious rites, that is R-I-T-E-S, that honor animals in liturgical acts of animal blessing and in ceremonies when animals die. Andrew Lindsay, who I'm greatly indebted to and who has written extensively in this area, actually has a little book called Animal Rights, and we've used portions in our Eucharistic liturgy and various prayers and services of remembrance. Part of the role of revisiting tradition is to discover a counter-tradition, a tradition that lies beneath the surface and stands in contrast to what has been the dominant Christian tradition. Through this process, we can recover lost voices that may be able to speak in fresh ways to our time and to our particular situation. This leads me to the last two sources of authority. There is reason, which speaks to how we engage Scripture and tradition, and then to a source many would add, experience, or what it is that makes tradition a living and evolving tradition. We're clearly in a different situation today concerning the fate of non-human animals than that of the biblical world or the intervening centuries. And to mention only two examples, there's been the emergence of factory farming on a massive scale and the dramatic increase in the consumption of meat in the diets of many of the world's peoples. Our present experiences demand that Christians reassess both their teachings and their practices, taking into special account the situation of non-human animals in our time, so we can then join with other persons of goodwill to take appropriate action. I now turn from the sources of authority to four directional markers which seek to capture some dimensions of an alternative to what J. McDaniel calls the instrumentalist tradition. This alternative he names as the Franciscan Alternative. And at the heart of this alternative, he writes, is a recognition that individual animals are kin to us, that they have value in and for themselves, and that they are sacramental presences in human life. So then second, what are some directional markers that guide Christians in understanding and in taking action? Directional markers, and here I'm borrowing a term from the theologian Richard Young, are what navigators use to provide a sense of where to go. Directional markers are not moral absolutes nor rules. They should rather be seen primarily as ways of seeing, which can shape human character and hence inform action. They should aid Christians as they come to regard non-human animals not as commodities or property to be used and exploited, but as a source of blessing. In what follows, I will be drawing from my own Episcopal Anglican tradition because I know it best, and again upon the writings of Andrew Lindsay, an Anglican who in 1992 was appointed to the world's first chair in theology and animal welfare at Mansfield College, Oxford. The first directional marker then is a recovery of the biblical view that this world is not our creation. We live in God's world. This marker involves not only an acknowledgement of our contingent status, but a shift in our frame of reference regarding the rest of creation. As Thomas Berry, a Roman Catholic Passionist priest who died this past June, has said, our sense of reality must consciously shift from an anthropocentric to a biocentric norm of reference. This anthropocentrism is largely consequent on our failure to think of ourselves as a species. In addition, because the world is God's world, all creatures are to be seen as God's creatures. A second directional marker is that creation is a web of interconnected relationships. Again, I turn to Thomas Berry, who captured this insight in a remark he famously made that the universe is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. I just love that phrase. The universe is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. In a significant development for our tradition, a gathering of Anglican Episcopal bishops from around the world held in 1998, it was affirmed the biblical vision of creation as a web of interdependent relationships bound together with the covenant which God has established with the whole earth and every living being. The divine spirit is sacramentally present in creation, which is therefore to be treated with reverence, respect, and gratitude. Human beings are both co-partners with the rest of creation, with the responsibility to make personal and corporate sacrifices for the common good of all creation. 3, the redemptive purpose of God in Jesus Christ extends to the whole of creation. This reflects an inclusive moral vision that challenges the long-standing perspective that creation is hierarchical with humankind at the top of the hierarchy, emphasizing instead our web-like relationship to the rest of creation. J. McDaniel picks up this theme in his elaboration of the alternative he calls Franciscan. In short, a Franciscan alternative is holistic rather than issue-dominated. It is not human-centered, animal-centered, plant-centered, or system-centered at the expense of these other centers. Rather, it is divinely centered in a way that understands all life, individually and communally, within an interconnected and diverse whole. A third directional marker builds from this and regards animals as having intrinsic value in and for themselves. Theologian Lindsay lifts up two insights which lie at the heart of the animal rights movement, but which are, I believe, broader than that movement. The first insight is that animals are not commodities, resources, machines, means to ends, or beings here for our use, but sentient beings capable of pain and suffering with intrinsic value. The second is that there must be moral limits to what we may do to animals. Even theologians who do not accept that animals have rights in a technical sense generally acknowledge that at least some animals display sufficient consciousness and self-awareness to merit special moral consideration. A fourth directional marker is a theme Christians find throughout the Bible and embodied in the life and teaching of Jesus, that the powerful have a special duty to protect the weak and the vulnerable, and to address the needs of the suffering. This is a theme worthy of much elaboration. Here I offer only a few brief comments. Reflecting on the position of St. Thomas regarding animals, Andrew Lindsay writes in his most recent book, Why Animal Suffering Matters, I think it's his best book, St. Thomas was not entirely wrong in seeing a kind of implicit moral hierarchy in the world, except that he misunderstood it at its most important and relevant point, namely that the higher should serve the lower rather than the reverse. The notion of human mastery is replaced by the notion of service, and humans become not the master species, but the servant species. With the knowledge that some animals are sentient beings who are aware, who can feel pain and pleasure, and can experience suffering, this marker can lead Christians to actions that affect the well-being, or what are sometimes described as the interests of animals. Animals are widely seen to possess many interests, among them freedom from pain and suffering, provision of decent and natural living conditions, and the ability to make choices. These interests are now, for example, flagrantly violated in factory farms. I think the other panel going on at this time is addressing that question, and in puppy mills. At its General Convention in the year 2003, our Episcopal Church adopted a resolution to recognize that the responsible care for animals falls within the stewardship of creation. Its members are encouraged to ensure that husbandry methods for captive and domestic animals prohibit suffering in such conditions which would include factory farms. Its members also should be educated to ethical standards in the care and treatment of animals, and the Church should advocate for legislation protecting animals and effective enforcement measures. This resolution is now being implemented. Finally, what are some of the unresolved issues and challenges? There are a variety of issues and challenges around which there is much discussion and debate, which I'm sure you'll hear more about perhaps in a little bit, not yet resolved in what I'm proposing as a broad alternative Christian vision. The first, which I already alluded to briefly above, is this: should Christians see animals as having rights? And if so, how should these rights be defined, and how should they be grounded? How should they be captured in legislation and in legal codes? This is a complicated and often contentious cluster of questions. The arguments advanced from various sides draw upon the history of philosophy and are extensive and highly nuanced. And then what happens when rights come into conflict? One very interesting question for many Christians involved with both environmental concerns and animal welfare is this: how can the tension between the rights of ecosystems and the rights of individual organisms be resolved? Andrew Lindsay, as a leading Christian component of animal rights, is concerned with how animal rights are anchored. He believes any discussion of animal rights by Christians must be grounded in what he calls theos rights, or the rights of the Creator to have creation treated with respect. Indeed, the whole debate, he writes, about animals is precisely about the rights of the Creator. From a theological perspective, rights are not something awarded, granted, won, or lost, but something recognized. To recognize animal rights is to recognize the intrinsic value of God-given life. If God is the sovereign Creator, all rights in an absolute sense are God's. Rights language helps to focus our attention on the value of what is given by the Creator in the sentient lives of other creatures. So then what about the place of humans? Christians who are full animal rights proponents still recognize that there is a unique role in creation for humans. Again, to cite Andrew Lindsay, it may well be the special task of humans within creation is to do what other creatures cannot do, at least in a consciously deliberate way, namely honor, respect, and rejoice in the creation in which God rejoices. One ecofeminist theologian, Carol Adams, who's involved in animal issues, advocates for an ethic of care instead of animal rights. In an interview, she stated, "My concern about animal rights language is that it arises within the same philosophical framework that gave us a differentiation between what was man-human and everyone else. The universal rights language is part of the notion of the Enlightenment man who was an autonomous being separate from everyone else. In fact, no one is autonomous. We first learn in relationships. We learn to walk. We learn to talk in relationships. So the ethics of care critiques the notion of the autonomous man upon which the fundamental right is based. But secondly, the language of animal rights came out of a need to prove that not only was it not emotional, but it was manly. We are getting upset by non-humans. It's not that it is upsetting, it's the right thing to do. And some of us have come along and said it is upsetting. Being upset is a legitimate form of knowledge. Why can't we trust anger and other emotions that we feel when we hear about chickens being debeaked and veal calves being removed from their mothers in less than 24 hours? Why can't outrage and caring truly inform who we are as people? A second and closely related and also controversial issue concerns the question of adopting a vegetarian or vegan diet. In a comprehensive article in the Anchor Yale Dictionary of the Bible, Edwin Firmage reminds us, regardless of the place or period in question, diets in antiquity were predominantly vegetarian. The use of animal products was in large measure confined to milk, curds, and cheeses. Based upon figures in the Mishnah, it has been estimated that in Roman Palestine, for example, cereals constituted perhaps 50% of the caloric intake in the average Jewish diet, with wine, olive oil, legumes, fruit making up the rest. Although precise figures are seldom given, studies of diet in other areas of the ancient world confirm that meat was not a common item in the average diet. Most people could afford to eat meat only on special occasions. Typically accompanying these was a sacrifice of some sort. Indeed, it was not uncommon for a single animal to provide both the sacrifice and the meal. Every use of meat thus became a sacral meal, and every act of animal slaughter a sacrifice. The Bible makes this connection explicit. Some Christian proponents of vegetarianism, while recognizing the concession to meat eating in the covenant with Noah mentioned earlier, seek to live now into the vision of the peaceable kingdom. It is the story they want to be in. Others stress that it is the most consistent position with their understanding of the moral status of animals. The latter would argue, if you see that animals have rights, including chiefly the right to continue living, then raising and killing animals for food is morally wrong. It is further held that what may have been necessary for life in the biblical world or in ages past is no longer true in our day, at least in the affluent nations. Other Christians have not adopted a vegetarian diet, and while recognizing that killing is a grave matter, choose to live within the covenant concession of eating flesh and the general practice of figures in the Bible, including Jesus. In so doing, they're making a distinction between human rights and non-human rights. At the same time, they may seek to reduce their total consumption of meat, oppose cruelty and suffering, and the practice of factory farming, and in general adopt affirmative consumer practices which support the interests and welfare of non-human animals. An interesting question for contemporary Christians to ponder is this: would Jesus be a vegetarian if he were living today? These issues and challenges, along with many others, remain, but among those who are concerned, there is a great deal which can be agreed upon to improve the well-being of animals, drawing upon this broad, emerging, alternative Christian vision. Finally, I want to slow down for this because it has some lovely phrases in it. The blessing of animals was for me only a beginning. Through this door, I was drawn over these past 20 years of blessing into some far-reaching questions of liturgy, theology, ethics, and spiritual practice. I've been involved in rites of remembrance at the grave sites of animals, as well as in extended pastoral conversations around the experience of grief and loss, which come from the death of a beloved animal companion. These experiences frequently awaken a new depth and capacity within the human spirit to care for creation as a whole. Finally, I've come to see that there is a distinctive spirituality which is the gift of an attentiveness to the presence of non-human animals and their place in the wider creation. This spirituality may take many forms. In each act of blessing, for example, I strive to look into the eyes of the beloved and often quite excited animal companion. These are fleeting moments, to be sure, but I'm drawn through them in a prayerful way into what can be understood as a sacramental awareness, a consciousness of the divine spirit moving in and through creation. In Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima captures this way of seeing as he gives this advice. Love all God's creation, the whole of it, and every grain of sand. Love every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things. And once you've perceived it, you will begin to comprehend it ceaselessly, more and more every day, and you will come to love the whole world with an abiding, universal love. Indeed, I believe we are beginning to see what could become new forms of contemplative practice and a spirituality which holds promise for the welfare of animals and the care of God's creation in this, our island home. I close with a well-loved prayer of St. Basil of the 4th century, who entreated God to enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things, our brother the animals to whom you gave the earth as their home in common with us. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised the high dominion of humans with ruthless cruelty, so that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to you in song, has been a groan of travail. May we realize that they live not for us alone, but for themselves and for you, and that they love the sweetness of life. Thank you.
This is about a sophisticated technological act I can perform here. So, on the information highway, I have a flat tire.
You're not alone.
Okay, good. I'm glad Steve is with me on everybody. So Stephen's talked about theology and animals, and I'm going to talk about philosophy and animals. First of all, I'd like to thank whoever invited me, or was behind the invitation. Thank you very much. I'm not a lawyer, but it's great to be here. And there's a long history, just as there is in theology, a long history in philosophy, trying to figure out the moral status of animals. In the ancient Greek period, Aristotle and the Stoics pretty much suggest that animals are here strictly for our use. So I think a lot of thinking that goes on today is historical thinking regarding animals. A lot of people don't realize it. Aristotle and the Stoics got sedimented into pop culture, and people are still thinking through Aristotle in spite of themselves. But there was also in the ancient period the Pythagorean and Platonic tradition, and an author named Porphyry who wrote a book called De Abstinentia, which is the first full-length treatise, trying to argue for the moral status of animals. Now, most people's knowledge of philosophic thought about animals, I suspect in the culture in which we live, is informed by the material that came out from Peter Singer and Tom Regan in the 70s. So I'm going to try to update that debate with thought of Martha Nussbaum. So my comments are titled Nussbaum, Mental Disability and Animal Entitlements, a Rawlsian Perspective. So Martha Nussbaum is probably the most important public philosopher out there today. She teaches in the philosophy department in the law school at the University of Chicago. And just a couple of years ago, she started directing her attention to issues regarding animal rights. And I'm going to respond from the perspective of probably the most influential political philosopher of the 20th century, John Rawls. By the way, somebody this morning, one of the speakers said, no picture, no story. So I hope in this case he's wrong, because I have no pictures. First section is an introduction, and I'll summarize some of these sections. I'll keep to my time limit, but I won't finish everything that's on the website there. In several of Martha Nussbaum's recent writings, she has expanded her concern for those historically left out of the male-dominated social contract, women, the mentally disabled, to include non-human animals. Hereafter, I'm just going to refer to them as animals. Her own approach to animal entitlements is called the capabilities approach, which both borrows from and rejects certain aspects of both the utilitarian approach to animals and a rights-based approach. But her stance regarding the relationship between social contract theory and animals is almost entirely negative. Here, there's no borrowing. The purpose of the present paper is to examine her treatment of utilitarianism, rights theory, and especially social contract theory, as these theories relate to the issue of animal entitlements. I will argue that a very favorable approach to animal entitlements can, in partial contrast to Nussbaum, be developed on a Rawlsian, not that it comes from Rawls himself, but a Rawlsian social contract basis, even if Rawls himself did not develop such an approach. However, the Rawlsian approach I will defend is not intended to challenge Nussbaum's own capabilities approach, but to supplement it, as in mutually reinforcing strands in a Persian cable that binds together different philosophical defenses of animal entitlements. Now, the second section of the paper deals with utilitarianism. I'm going to skip most of that and just say a few things about utilitarianism. And as you may know, Singer is a utilitarian. So it's ironic that the person who probably did more to popularize the issue of animal rights than anybody, Peter Singer, in that book, Animal Liberation, is really not an animal rightist at all. Okay, or at least you have to put scare quotes around the word rights. All versions of utilitarianism are vulnerable regarding the question of numbers. Utilitarianism is a view that suggests that moral action is one that leads to the greatest good for the greatest number. So it's a type of applied mathematics. And the vulnerability regarding numbers is seen in Singer's defense of what he calls the replaceability argument. According to this argument, if animals, and some marginal human beings perhaps, are raised in humane conditions and are replaced with the same number of members of the same species, they can be killed with equanimity if the killing is painless. It's a remarkable view that Singer holds. What is bothersome in this argument, according to Nussbaum, is that individuals are viewed as replaceable containers of satisfactions, rather than as ends in themselves who are capable of flourishing and who desire to flourish in their own unique ways. There's a certain irony here. Despite the fact that Nussbaum's capabilities approach is, in general, closer to Rawlsian social contract theory than it is to utilitarianism, and this in part due to the problems Nussbaum sees in utilitarian views of the good, her capabilities approach to animals in particular is closer to utilitarianism than it is to Rawlsian social contract theory. This rapprochement with utilitarianism is due to utilitarianism's skepticism about conventional morality, which historically has often ignored animals. That is, social contract theory in general has a tendency to treat all animals as strays or outside the bounds of the contractor's original position, whereas utilitarianism gives them a home, or at least a shelter where they're safe for a while. Animal entitlements are ultimately not secure in utilitarianism because, on this view, animals are denied separateness, uniqueness, and inviolability. Further, the preference satisfaction utilitarian like Singer has to admit misinformed, malicious, or fear-induced preferences into the calculus, even pathological preferences that are the result of addiction. As before, animals are viewed by even preference satisfaction utilitarians as merely replaceable containers of satisfactions with no convincing account offered for some ranking these satisfactions. So I hope I'm not offending too many people. I suspect in an audience like this, a lot of people have Peter Singer as one of their heroes, and he's a great person, but I think his utilitarian view, is ultimately not a defensible one. Now, the third section deals with rights-based views, and I'm just going to summarize some of that as well. It's clear that Nussbaum has greater affinity with Tom Regan's rights-based view of animals than with Singer's utilitarian approach. And then also, in addition to Regan, she likes Stephen Wise's view, and I think he's right next door here. So let's ask this question real briefly. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the rights-based view on Nussbaum's reasoning? One strength is the determination of rights-based theorists like Regan and Wise to view each animal as an end and an unwillingness to submit the interests of animals to a general utilitarian calculus where they could be used for some aggregative good, to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. That's the problem with utilitarianism. Individuals can be used as long as the aggregate good is enhanced. Second, rights-based views of animals do not have to be based solely on sentience, as do utilitarian views. For example, deprivation of liberty or bodily integrity can count as evils on rights-based views, even if they do not register in the creature's awareness or in the utilitarian calculus. So imagine a newborn animal that was denied freedom to move. There was no pain inflicted on it. There might not be anything wrong with that on the utilitarian view if the pain didn't register in the animal's consciousness. But that would be a problem on the rights-based view. But Nussbaum sees two problems with rights-based views of animals, problems to which I'll return a bit later. The first is that rights-based views are overly insistent regarding moral egalitarianism, she thinks, although Nussbaum admits that the species barrier itself is of no moral relevance. She thinks that morally relevant traits might often be correlated with species membership. Presumably what she has in mind is the idea that although being a member of the human species is not in itself morally relevant, with species membership in biology referring merely to being in the breeding population, the fact that human beings typically have several high-level capabilities for autonomy and rational thought is morally relevant. In this regard, Nussbaum thinks that Singer is closer to the truth than Regan, in that the latter is more firmly committed to the moral irrelevance of species membership. The other problem with the rights-based view of animal entitlements, according to Nussbaum, is that rights in general are a little loose and vague unless they are incorporated into an ethical approach that spells out the basis for rights. In effect, rights are defensible only when they are seen in the broader neo-Aristotelian context of the capabilities approach. So Nussbaum herself is a neo-Aristotelian. The fourth section of the paper deals with criticisms of social contract theory. So I'd like to indicate here why Nussbaum criticizes social contract theory, with Rawls being the sort of quintessential, the most important social contract theorist. Rawls thinks that duties of justice are based on the idea of reciprocity, and he assumes that animals are incapable of reciprocity. As a result, Nussbaum concludes that we have no duties of justice to animals on a contractarian basis. If we ought to be compassionate to animals, as Rawls seems to admit, such compassion is nonetheless outside the scope of justice. Perhaps the duty to be compassionate is an indirect duty, similar to the one found in the Stoics, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Kant. We have duties regarding animals, but not to them, as of the duty not to torture animals. In that violation of this duty makes it more likely that we would torture reciprocating human beings. In any event, compassion regarding animals is not part of the basic structure of society in social contract theory. Nussbaum finds this approach inadequate for several reasons. Most notably, social contract theorists postpone animal entitlements until a later stage of politics after the basic structure is in place, in effect leaving the issue for politicians and judges to deal with. Notice, he's backing off and saying, look, there's no way philosophically we can deal with these cases. Just let the judges deal with them as best they can. And this is what? An abdication of responsibility, as Nussbaum correctly notes. Further, she thinks that by identifying citizens with their mental and moral powers, not with their animal bodies, social contract theorists in the Kantian tradition of moral philosophy, especially Rawls, separate human dignity from the natural animal world. She points out the following: the idea that at bottom we are split beings, both rational persons and animal dwellers in the world of nature, never ceases to influence Kant's way of thinking, and Rawls seems to adopt this way of thinking. This split fails to account for the fact that we human beings are dignified as animals, and it encourages us to think of ourselves as self-sufficient in the sense that we could, at least imaginatively, identify ourselves as numinal selves completely lacking animality, something like disembodied cogitos outside of time and stripped of the animal, specifically mammal dependencies that are essential parts of the human life cycle, especially in infancy and in cases of mental disability. That is, Nussbaum accuses social contract theorists, especially Rawls, of distorting the intimate, Aristotelian, hylomorphic connection between rationality and the well-being of our animal bodies. To be urged to care about rationality without being urged to care about our animality, she thinks, leaves us with an inadequate basis for thinking about our needs, including what Rawls would call our need for basic goods. In sum, recognizing greater continuity between humans and other animals may actually be essential for thinking well about ourselves. Despite Nussbaum's affinity in many other respects to Rawls' political liberalism, she thinks that it fails miserably regarding animals. We will see that she need not be so pessimistic regarding social contract theory. Once again, the point is not to develop a more positive view of animal entitlements so as to compete with Nussbaum's capabilities approach, but to complement her approach from a social contract point of view. I assume that, because of her own political liberalism, Nussbaum would welcome a more friendly connection between her capabilities approach and a Rawlsian approach to animal entitlements. But she's skeptical regarding any strong connection because of the implausibility of there being any contract between rational human beings and animals, primarily due to the asymmetry of power between the two. Nussbaum seems to conflate here the Rawlsian social contract and the Hobbesian one, the latter of which depends on each party's threat advantage in a state of nature. This is a mistake, I think, but Nussbaum's bigger error is to think of animals in a social contract context as deficient moral agents rather than as robust moral patients. I'd like to move next to the fifth section of the paper titled An Animal-Friendly Version of Social Contract Theory. And if there's anything really original in this paper, I'm going to do it here. So I may fail in what I'm trying to do, but I mean, this is where I'm trying to make a contribution to animal rights theory by defending animal rights on a social contract basis to supplement what Nussbaum's trying to do. So it's not an either-or thing. I'm trying to add on to all the great work that Nussbaum is doing. I will assume that the listener is familiar with two basic arguments commonly used by defenders of animal entitlements, including, in a way, Nussbaum. The first of these, everybody's familiar with this argument. The first of these is the argument from sentience, which, in abbreviated form, suggests that, premise one, it's morally wrong to do avoidable harm to a sentient being who is capable of being harmed. Premise two, if such avoidable harm is done routinely to animals when they're seen as sources of food and clothing, etc. And then in the conclusion, thus it's morally wrong to use them in these ways. The second argument is that from marginal cases, which, again in abbreviated form, suggests that Rawlsian reasonableness and rationality is not a defensible criterion for moral patiency, in that it would exclude many human beings, the marginal cases of humanity, from the class of moral patients, thereby making it possible to eat infant burgers or, more plausibly, to experiment painfully or lethally on mentally deficient humans. In other words, what I'm trying to get at here is that I think there's general agreement about the criteria that would have to be met in order to be a moral agent. Just to be held accountable for your actions, and that's rationality. And it may be difficult to figure out whether or not a particular being is sufficiently rational to be a moral agent, but just about everybody agrees that that's the property that would have to be met. Now, I take it that the criterion for moral patiency status is much more controversial. I mean, what property do you have to possess in order to deserve moral respect? Now, if you make rationality do double duty, such that it's the criteria for moral patiency status as well as the criteria for moral agency status, disastrous results occur. Because if you have to be rational to deserve moral respect, then many members of our own species, those with mental deficiencies, would not, that's where the infant burger comment comes from, would not deserve moral respect. Now that's an outlandish hypothesis, but actually I don't think it's a sci-fi hypothesis to suggest that if you had to be rational in order to deserve moral respect, many people would start experimenting painfully and lethally on human beings who are mentally deficient. I mean, that's actually happening, right? But I think life is too low a criterion and too inclusive, because then bugs, plant cells, and so on and so forth would be the loci of rights. So I think the defensible criterion for moral patiency status is sentiency, which would include all human beings, but then also would include animals with central nervous systems. So if the marginal cases have rights, however, as Nussbaum rightly thinks they do, then the same basic rights should be granted to animals who are at equivalent levels of morally relevant criteria like cognitive and affective abilities, especially the ability to be harmed or pained. That is, the argument for marginal cases can just as easily be referred to as the argument for moral consistency, if the phrase marginal cases is found objectionable. To avoid the argument, as Rawls tries to do, by in effect claiming that non-rational yet sentient human beings deserve moral respect, but animals who are non-rational yet sentient do not, because they are human beings, is to resort to speciesism. This is a type of arbitrariness like classism, racism, and sexism, with which both Nussbaum and Rawls want to avoid. There are three ways in which one could develop a more marginal, case-friendly, and animal-friendly social contract of view than the one found in Rawls' own writings. The first concerns the room available within the concept of natural duty to defend the argument from sentiency. The concept of natural duty becomes understandable when we realize that it is redundant to have reasonable contractors promise not to murder each other. We need the reasonable contract for the difficult cases. And there's all reasonable people who are going to agree that we shouldn't murder each other. It is crucial to notice that Rawls himself lists among our natural duties the duty not to harm or injure another and the duty not to cause unnecessary suffering. In fact, these two negative duties are, according to Rawls, stronger than any positive natural duties we might have. These natural duties apply without regard to our voluntary acts, as in those found in the original position of Rawls, which is a decision-making procedure or position where reasonable people are sort of forced to be reasonable to figure out what criteria would operate in a just society. These features are what suggest the propriety of the adjective natural, a designation that would presumably be acceptable in Nussbaum as well. If there is a natural duty not to cause unnecessary suffering, it makes sense to suggest that this duty applies to all beings who have the capacity to suffer, say to all beings with central nervous systems. Once again, there's some textual evidence to suggest that Rawls thinks that animals ought not to be treated cruelly, as Nussbaum notices, even though they are not themselves bound by the natural duty not to be cruel. Why not also say that animals ought to be treated justly, even if they are not duty-bound to be just? In other words, there are beings out there who are not sufficiently rational to be held accountable for their actions such that they can be just to others, but because they're sentient, deserve to be treated justly by others. Second, it is possible to argue in favor of a revised original position, which is more favorable to the idea of animal entitlements than the original position, which I think is not a redundancy. That is, the Rawlsian original position should be reconceived. Even if we assume that only reasonable, rational human beings can inhabit the original position, this does not necessarily mean that only they can be incarnated when the veil of ignorance is lifted. The veil of ignorance needs to be thicker so as to include vision not only of one's race, class, and sex, but also of one's species. The reason for this thicker veil is that animals have individual welfare in the sense that their experiential lives can go well or ill for them. At the very least, they can be treated cruelly, as Rawls himself admits. The argument for marginal cases can be used to supplement Rawls, in that many marginal human beings, whom Rawls wants to protect by decisions made in the original position, no more possess moral agency than do most higher animals, that is, those with central nervous systems. In the revised original position, we can identify principles that would reasonably adjudicate conflicting claims among all sentient creatures. Remember that parties in the original position must assume that they could turn out to be among the least intellectually advantaged human beings, which could be seen to imply that they might even turn out to be severely mentally deficient. In other words, if we were making up the rules to a just society in this room under a condition of ignorance, such that we would not know what properties we would have out there, in the society that we would be constructing, behind the veil of ignorance, it would not make sense to adopt racist principles if you would not know what your race would be out there. In other words, if the possibility was that when we threw you out there, you would be black, you're much more likely to combat racism under this condition of ignorance, behind the veil of ignorance. Now, I'm trying to say the same thing about species membership. In other words, if what we were trying to do in a thought experiment was develop the principles of justice, right, that should operate in a society that at least approximated justice, and we were ignorant of what our species membership would be when we threw each member out there to live in the society according to the principles that we could agree to here, it would not be rational to adopt species as principles. In other words, under the condition of ignorance, you're forced to be unbiased. Now, even if only a small percentage of the human population fails to have moral agency, a sense of justice, and a rational plan of life, we're dealing with a significant number of people, perhaps tens of millions of them. Anencephalic infants, the seriously psychotic, a subset of Down syndrome cases, the severely mentally deficient, the senile, the irreversibly comatose, etc. There's no reason to think that Rawls would deny that we have duties of some sort to such beings, and he explicitly says that it would be unwise in practice to withhold treatment from them. If one says that we ought to extend just treatment to marginal cases, even though they are not odious, we are obviously left with a puzzle. A more efficacious way to deal with the matter at hand is to say that justice involves duties to those sentient yet non-rational human beings who are not moral agents, as well as to sentient yet non-rational animals who are not moral agents. Participants in the original position should choose principles for all beings with interests, or better, for all beings concerning whom we can speak of their own well-being or ill-being. Rawls' own apparent natural duty not to be cruel to animals seems to imply this. To choose in favor of marginal cases but not animals solely on the basis of species membership is to be speciesism, a failing that is analogous to being classist, racist, or sexist. We can put the matter this way. If then the original position were fully neutral, its participants would not only have to be ignorant of their race, sex, or social position, while participants in the just society would seem that they would also have to be ignorant of their species membership, subject only to the qualification that they shall have interests as participants in the just society. This version of the original position is not that of Rawls, yet it is not clear why it ought not to be. That is, we should not assume, as does Nussbaum, that Rawls was the best interpreter regarding the implications of his own theory of justice for animals. I think this happens a lot in intellectual history. For example, Lavoisier, discovered oxygen. In all the history of science books as the person who discovered oxygen, although he had no idea that's what it was he discovered. He thought he discovered something called dephlogisticated air. So I think Rawls has made a great discovery, but I don't think he was aware of exactly what it was he was discovering. What he's discovered is a powerful argument in favor of the claim that a just society would protect the rights of non-human animals with central nervous systems. If we knew we were to be incarnated as white or black, racist principles would more likely be chosen in the original position than if we did not have this knowledge. Likewise, if we assumed that we would be incarnated as human beings, speciesist principles would more likely be chosen than if we did not have this knowledge. If, however, we assume that we might each be incarnated as a sentient, non-rational being of whatever species, it would be reasonable in the original position to insist on duties to such a being, provided such a being posed no serious threat to others. It does not help much to respond by saying that animals do not even have the possibility of becoming moral agents when it is realized that permanently mentally disabled or senile human beings do not have this possibility either, as Nussbaum would no doubt admit. However, this revised original position is still compatible with due attention being paid to the more sophisticated interests of reasonable, rational beings. The interests of sentient yet non-rational beings could and indeed should be considered in the original position, despite what Nussbaum assumes about the original position. Those in the original position are rational and mutually disinterested, but Rawls himself implies that they might not have these qualities to any great extent when they are incarnated. The one restriction on the scope of this incarnation is that the being in question can benefit from the decisions made by the rational and mutually disinterested parties in the original position. Marginal cases in animals can so benefit, rocks and insects and plants presumably cannot, as Rawls himself admits. An example from fiction is helpful. In Daniel Keyes' book, Flowers for Algernon, which was made into the movie Charlie, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that with Pat Robertson, a severely mentally deficient man is made temporarily rational, in fact a genius, by a miracle drug that eventually wears off. We can easily imagine the demands he would make while rational regarding how he would like to be treated when the drug wears off. It's not too hard to do the same for the subject in question, a chimpanzee, a cow, or a laboratory mouse. Third, in addition to the existence of natural duties and the possibility of a revised original position, a defense of animal entitlements can be found in various comprehensive doctrines that citizens hold in a liberal democracy. That is, what we agree to in the original position will most likely be far less than what is included in our own comprehensive view, and that what we're looking for in the social contract is an overlapping consensus that can be reached with those who have views that, although reasonable and comprehensive, differ sometimes uncompromisingly from one's own. In fact, it's the existence of reasonable pluralism of comprehensive religious, philosophical, or moral views that creates the need for a social contract in the first place. In other words, some people are left-wing religious believers, and some are religious traditionalists, some are atheists and agnostics. I mean, this is why we need the social contract. And, without the social contract, we could just have competing conceptions of the good that might lead to chaos, or just assume in a Hobbesian way that any justice we would have would be the Hobbesian justice of right makes right. So the idea of a social contract is to try to figure out the terms that reasonable people would agree to when they're thinking reasonably. And that's why it's worthwhile to think through this original decision-making procedure where we operate under a veil of ignorance. No doubt, let me say one more thing, okay, and I'll be ready to call it quits. No doubt I will receive the criticism, actually I know there's a lot of criticisms, but at least one of the criticisms I'll receive is that to include mentally deficient human beings and animals into the class of moral patients is to concern ourselves with the justice of the universe and not merely with the justice of our own social institutions. If this were correct, then we would be dealing with theodicy or some other topic in philosophy of religion rather than with political philosophy. My reply is that in the original position, this distinction would be hard to maintain, and that it's precisely the worst possible cases, the most egregious forms of suffering, that we're supposed to think about, to in effect legislate out of existence the suffering of mentally deficient human beings or of animals, is to both beg the question in favor of rational anthropocentrism and to merely stipulate that justice is species-bound. Now, I have a section 6 on animal emotions. Mark Nussbaum has written really insightfully, I think, about animal emotions. the degree to which animal emotions very often have a rational character to them. In other words, many animals, when they are bothered, have reason to be bothered. Okay? She's very good on trying to break down the supposed split between rational interests on the one hand and emotions on the other. And her own position is called the capabilities approach. And then this last section of the paper deals with reflective equilibrium, which is the method at work in her philosophy and Rawls' philosophy. One practical matter that I disagree with Nussbaum on consists in the fact that she backs off a defense of vegetarianism.
Yeah.
So she takes away with one hand what she gave with the other. She has a very strange view. I suspect that she hasn't had much empirical experience, on factory farms or slaughterhouses. She has this idea that, in a way, it's like Singer's replaceability argument. She wonders what's wrong with having animals lead a full, natural life, right? As long as at the very end of their life, they're killed painlessly, and then we could eat them. I think she should talk to other meat eaters and then also the Food and Drug Administration. because they're not the sort of, animals that are almost carrion flesh are not the sort of beings that people want to eat, right? They want to eat young, vibrant animals, right, that are still healthy. So she backs off the practical consequence, I think, of her capabilities approach. Thank you very much.
Schneider, I saw you taking notes. Do you have any follow-up comments?
No, I'm just listening actively.
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
I'm curious, for both of you, what are the reactions of your students to this and your parishioners?
Well, varied. We showed a video that the Humane Society produced called Eating Mercifully, and I would say the people who saw it were very moved by it. We have others for whom they're struggling with these questions. Some, I would say the attitudes range from not so much disagreement as I don't want to think about that. It could change my life.
Have they heard your paper?
They haven't heard this particular paper. What I've done is versions of this as a St. Francis homily. My particular approach is really introducing people to a different way of seeing. That's kind of the principal lead strategy. I think we act out of the way we construct the world, how we look upon the world. So my principal thrust here has been both the experience of honoring animals, but also talking about what that means a little bit. So I would say that the responses are very, I think people are increasingly interested in these questions. And I think when they see, for example, talk about the value of the picture, when they see visually see pictures of the factory farm, they're deeply disturbed. That's been my experience.
And I'm another academic. I'm curious what your students think of you.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that quite apart from the substantive views that they may take, the fact that they do have to think about this issue now is most notable. In other words, before Singer and Regan came on the scene, nobody was teaching the animal rights debate in courses of philosophical ethics around the world. It's because of Singer and Regan that now anybody who takes a course in ethics in any philosophy department is just about anywhere now. In Europe, East Asia, African universities, they're modeled after European universities all over North America. Everybody reads about the animal rights debate now. So the fact that they have to think about it is noteworthy. In terms of their reaction, there is many authors out there arguing against animal rights, or almost as many as there are arguing in favor. But there are certainly many, many more philosophers who defend animal rights than would have before Singer and Regan. So if you have a long-range view, I do think this analogy to the efforts of the abolitionists trying to bring down slavery may be strong analogies. If you have a long-range view, I think we should be encouraged. And I think, let me not say my own view there, but I think many students have that view as well.
Go ahead up here.
Hi. I'm one of those professional students, and other than getting an animal law degree, for example, do you see a curriculum in the universities, like animal welfare, some sort of degree, some structure. As someone just craving knowledge, and I have a nursing degree, I'd like to see some sort of structure in the curriculums for those of us to attend.
Well, one of the big things now all over the place, this is true in Europe as well as here and in East Asia, is to move away from strict disciplinary identification where you're a philosophy major, right, or a history major and so on. The big thing now are these interdisciplinary programs like women's studies, environmental studies, and there are some universities that have programs in animal studies where you would study animals from, I don't know, 10 different disciplinary perspectives, biology, psychology, and so on. So those things are in existence.
I have a question on, for both of you, how you would handle this. One of the issues that comes up, and I know Amnesty has said these sorts of things, that if you can't be concerned about animal rights because so many humans are suffering. And so how do you answer that from a philosophical standpoint and from a religious standpoint, that something that you have to choose one or the other?
Why? I mean, I think there's a call to engage both questions. So we're actively involved in the Millennium Development Goals, and I do a dinner every Friday night for people who are hungry. We deal with systemically some of the issues that come out of that. I find that they're obviously there's a question of where you put your energy and attention and how much goes here versus how much goes somewhere else. But I think in the same way that we have competing moral demands in many areas of life, I think this just represents part of the complexity to try to find where we can make the greatest contribution and to be aware that these are both worthy endeavors.
I would respond in terms of, this is a very traditional moral principle. This goes back to Thomas Aquinas, to the Greeks, the idea that negative duties are prior to positive duties. So the first moral principle is what? Do no harm. So my duties to you are first and foremost, don't harm you, don't steal things from you. You have all these negative duties. Now, I probably do have positive duties to you as well, but they, in a way, don't even kick in until I've performed all the negative duties. Like if you need a job, it's not clear to me that I should be spending a lot of time, helping fulfill a positive duty I might have to you to help you get a job. But I should always be performing the negative duties, not to inflict harm on you and so on. Now, the animal rights position is largely built on negative duties. Now, this changes somewhat when you're dealing with wild animals and you have wildlife management issues and so on. But if you think of what the animal rightist is saying, he or she is claiming what? You ought not to kill animals when you could have a healthy diet on a vegetarian basis, right? You ought not to experiment painfully or lethally on animals when you could do research science on some other basis. So I don't know. I mean, I think you could fulfill at least the negative duties that the animal rightist wishes to defend and still have all of the time that you would have had otherwise to work for Amnesty International or Transparency International or work at a soup kitchen. So the priority of negative duties over positive duties, I think, undermines that objection.
That's a great point.
How about way in the back?
Hi, thanks very much. I have two questions, and unfortunately there's one for each of you, so I can't possibly disguise my second as a follow-up. But Reverend, first, I had a question about Genesis and the contrast between dominion and service and loving stewardship.
Right.
And I wonder if God had meant loving stewardship, why he would have said dominion, and does that mean that we're forced to eschew literalism in favor of interpretation and metaphor if we're going to have a more inclusive view of animal rights in our biblical scholarship?
Well, I think the question of how you're dealing with how you interpret a particular word, how you translate it, how you hear it. I guess part of it is also sort of looking at the context of simply the co-location of animals and humans on the same day of creation. The broad picture, it seems to be of care for creation, and I think that it's in the broad context of the story itself, and that I find that the question of how that particular term is used, I think all words find their fullest meaning through context, and I think dominion is one of those words.
You're okay with it?
I'm okay with that. I sure am.
And Professor, just a quick question also. Is there such a thing, I'm not familiar too much with the various schools of philosophy like that you discussed, but is there such a thing as like rights-based utilitarianism, where maybe perhaps like the American Constitution, you have finding the greatest utility assigned to Congress and state legislatures in the context of rights that are guaranteed for their own work as kind of a starting point? Is that an approach?
Yeah, so I distinguish between utilitarianism and rights-based views, but there are various shades of gray between those two. For example, rule utilitarianism is often seen as halfway between act utilitarianism and a rights-based approach. So yeah, there's a lot of gray areas in between that you could defend.
Let me just pick up one sort of little footnote. I also used, in addition to loving stewardship, the term responsibility in the quote from Kim Fabricius. And I think that word, being responsible, is the word I would kind of lift up that has the sharpest link to dominion.
I have a question for Reverend Schneider. In the movie All Roads Lead Home, a young girl asks a question, and I want to ask the same question. Do animals have souls? In my discussion with pastors in our arguments about hunting, pastors who either hunt or sympathize with the sport of hunting, they say it's okay to hunt because animals don't have souls. Do animals have souls?
Speculative for me, that question. Do I have a leaning or a bias? I think...
How do you interpret the Bible, God's Word?
I see that animals have a place in the life and heart of God. And I don't think that question is specifically addressed per se in the Bible. We can talk a good bit about, speculatively about what that might be, but to stay with the text, I'm not clear on that. The only thing I am clear on is that they have a place in the dominion, the overall creation of God, and in the vision of a finally reconciled creation. One would see, that's the vision of Isaiah. There's a place there, and so there is a place in the larger vision of God. What that specifically does around souls, the whole soul-body discussion is under rather significant kind of review now. But I would that's how I would approach it.
So you think it's okay to go out hunting because animals don't have souls?
No,
I didn't say that.
I didn't say that.
He didn't say that.
I'm sorry, no. I wouldn't use that argument for...
Farming. I'm talking about the sport of hunting.
That's not what he's saying.
Right.
Oh, he didn't say that at all.
Right. I wasn't addressing the question of how one describes or how one discusses the question of do animals have souls as having any bearing on the hunting question. I think that obviously has been used by some pastors that you've heard, and it's certainly not an argument I would make.
I think this kind of brings in two things. One is, in the early Christians, there was a school called agnostics, remember that, which I understand is like, how do you act when you don't know the answer, kind of thing. You search for knowledge. And also, science is kind of built on that same premise. You search for knowledge, and you kind of presume you don't immediately have that knowledge. So I see Gnosticism and science is kind of related. Well, in the question of do animals have souls, we don't know, but you can still act with the most good, least harm, which is kind of a Buddhist concept. Which is, what's wrong with that? Most good, least harm. If you don't know the answer, do the least harm. It's Hippocrates' oath in medicine. Similar.
But doesn't the Bible in certain instances refer to the souls of animals? How do we know that the souls of animals go down and the souls of man go up?
You'd have to help me with text here.
I have an article, and I'm afraid I didn't bring it with me, and I'll mail it to you, that I wrote.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So this is primarily for Professor Dombrowski, but if you have comments, please feel free. I have an academic background in philosophy, so I'm going to try not to get too technical, but I do want to get a little bit deeper into this stuff. I'm wondering primarily, now I have a paper unpublished that goes along very much the same lines you do in terms of revising Rawls, so I'm sympathetic to the argument. But before we ever get there, to avoiding speciesism and revising the veil to be a little bit thicker, I'm wondering why we're giving up so much ground on the question of moral agency and rationality. So it seems to me, of course it goes back much deeper than this, but for the purposes of cutting off the kind of historical chain of reasoning somewhere, it seems to me that we have adopted primarily in the philosophical community the Kantian notion of rationality, especially when it relates to rational agency and whether or not you have it. And Kant tries to justify rationality in a couple of different ways, but all of which essentially tie back to his basis of morality in terms of self-reflective adherence to duty, your ability to apply the categorical imperative in the first version of universalization of maxims, and essentially not analyze different people's different emotional perspectives, but to analyze the logical implications of that in terms of whether or not it's logically coherent and whether or not it's inherently contradictory. I think that the problem with that is on a couple of levels. One, that rules out pretty much every human that's ever been, not just marginal cases. This rules out every person that we think of as being born as inherently good and inherently righteous and inherently compassionate. And it includes the people who we think of as not inherently that way, but having to struggle to get there by applying logic and Kantian rationality. And so in my mind, Kant is conflating the idea of morality with the ability to do complex moral philosophy. And those are incredibly not the same thing. And there are simpler methods available, even if you take the lines of Kantian rationality and reciprocity to go to the third version of categorical imperative, to the kingdom of ends, and the contractarian view that Rawls eventually goes to. You don't need to ever get to things like your ability to apply the first categorical imperative and for logical contradictions or do advanced moral philosophy. All you need is a simple ability to recognize the needs and desires of others and engage in some kind of moral reciprocity. And in this respect, Kant and people who sympathize with Kant are, with no offense to them, 100 years behind science. The empirical data that we have today simply does not support the thesis that animals cannot be reciprocal moral beings. There are well-documented, peer-reviewed studies that rhesus monkeys, for instance, will not inflict harm on other rhesus monkeys, even to the repercussions of themselves starving. So if you put rhesus monkeys in a room where they can view another rhesus monkey and teach them if they push a buzzer that delivers a painful shock to the other rhesus monkey, they get food. And if they don't deliver the shock, they don't get food for long periods of time. And only 11% of rhesus monkeys were willing to push that buzzer. Over half of them were willing to not push the buzzer even for up to 2 weeks at a time.
So they did better than the humans in the building.
Of course, they did better than humans. And this is true. This is true not only for rhesus monkeys, but for pretty much every higher mammal which we have ever subjected to a similar test. And so where this goes to is, why do we ever have to extend the veil of ignorance to be so thick that we're essentially appointing rational agents to stand in moral agency for animals who we're calling non-rational agents, non-moral agents? Why can't we simply alter the view of rationality to be a little bit more reasonable? And instead of setting the bar so high and defining it into humans and humans only, you set the bar to something that empirical science supports and modern thought supports, and say, based upon this view of reciprocity, animals are moral agents. End of story.
Okay, I have several things to say by way of response, but in general, I want to say I agree with you.
Okay.
Except for the last sentence there about end of response period, I'd like the conversation to go on.
Of course.
Okay, yeah. but I generally agree with you. So, it's sort of, in pop culture, people often ask the question, what's it mean to be a moral being, right? Which beings count as moral beings? Now, that question is vague, because it fails to distinguish between what it means to be a moral agent, to be held accountable for your actions and so on, as opposed to what it means to be a moral agent. Now, that's crucial for my argument to make that distinction. But in both cases, I would say the same thing. The higher the criterion, or the higher the hurdle, to use an athletic metaphor, the higher the hurdle, the fewer the number of beings who will be able to clear the hurdle. So if you say in order to be a moral agent, you have to be as bright as Kant was, right? Then the only, and he was a really bright guy, right? So the only ones that are going to get over that high hurdle are Einstein, Martha Nussbaum, okay, some other really, bright people. Alfred North Whitehead, great mathematician. But then you're right in pointing out that that's too high a hurdle. And I also would want to claim, I think this is compatible with your view, that we ought not to have like a Kantian meat cleaver approach that says there's people who are rational and there are other beings who are not rational. Why not think of rationality on a continuum?
Absolutely.
Right? And if you think of rationality on a continuum, then there are ways in which you could see non-human animals as rational. And actually, what I was trying to say with this argument for marginal cases is that many animals will have higher degrees of rationality than some human beings. If we want to protect the rights of those human beings who have very little, if any, rationality, then in order to be consistent, we ought to be concerned about, the animals that have higher levels of rationality. Now, I want to say the same sort of thing about moral patience, too. Right? Too high a criterion of moral patience is disastrous, right? So we ought to think of moral patiency status. They're both continuum, right? They're moral agency and moral patience. And I agree with you that we should not have an all or nothing view that some beings are capable of reciprocity. And there you need not only rationality, but also reasonableness, willingness to get along with others. And if you have too high a criterion, then some of our colleagues, right? that was my attempted humor. Okay, people who are not willing to meet you halfway, right? I mean, it looks like they would not be capable of reciprocity. But then you have all these examples of seeing eye dogs, all sorts of animals who. Animals who affiliate are willing to have themselves affiliated with family life. They seem to be capable of reciprocity to a certain extent. So basically, I agree with you. Maybe I say things that made it sound as if I would not agree with you, but
it just sounded like you didn't want to go quite that far with things.
Yeah. Now, I do think. Now, I can see maybe what I said would be misleading. I do think if the topic that we want to discuss is what would a just society look like? If that's the question, I think that you're going to need some really bright people to deal with that question. But that does not mean that they would be the only ones who would be the beneficiaries made, behind the veil of ignorance. The principles that would govern a just society.
Just as a brief thought, if I can. How would you, this is something I've struggled with myself.
Speak up.
I'm sorry. I've struggled myself with the argument for marginal cases. And the classic response is to either A, say that rather than raising animals up, you're risking lowering those humans down, and that's a danger they're not willing to risk. Or some philosophers, R.J. Frey comes to mind, who are willing to, they claim, I don't think I believe them, but they claim that they're willing to accept those consequences and say, that's right, I can't think of any reason why those humans would qualify, so therefore they're out of even moral agency and possibly moral patiency status.
Yeah.
So I think the second one, the response is, tell me if you have another one, the response is, I don't think you're willing to stand by that. If I start rounding up a bunch of retarded infants and testing on them, I have a feeling you're going to have a problem with that. But I'm wondering how you would respond to the first one in terms of people who aren't willing to take that step and move certain humans out of the sphere of morality, but are worried that the argument for marginal cases, rather than trying to lift animals up, the real threat is that they're going to lower humans down.
Right, I see exactly what you're getting at there. So that's an interesting problem. So I'm arguing what? That once the moral irrelevance of species membership is established, then what we should do is upgrade our treatment of non-human animals to the way that we would treat mentally deficient human beings who are at mental or affective levels not superior to those of the non-human animals. But you're saying, couldn't it go the other way? Once the moral irrelevance of species membership is established, then how about if somebody comes along and says, why not now treat mentally deficient human beings the way we now treat animals? And that's where the infant burgers remark came in.
Right.
Now that's, That's a canard, obviously, but this, I think, does have real ramifications for painful and lethal experimentation. I do think that if mentally deficient human beings were available, there would be some scientists who would take advantage of this, right? Because they have.
It's happened, right?
Yes, principle in modal logic, what has happened is possible. Now, the only philosopher who argues that way is the one you mentioned, R.G. Freud. He's the only one who did that. But he does so because he's a utilitarian. He goes out and he's a very nice guy. He says, look, I say this not because I'm a moral monster or anything like that, but it's demanded by the logic of utilitarianism. It's if what it means to be moral is to act in such a way that you do maximize pleasure and minimize pain. That's your maximum. That's it, right? Then it would be moral to experiment painfully or lethally on mentally deficient human beings if it looked like that would be the best way, that you could cure some disease where a whole lot of people suffered from it and so on. I think that the lesson to be drawn from that is that there's something problematic about utilitarianism. I think that in other contexts as well, because I think Adam Smith was a utilitarian, but that gets us off into another. Because I think that's what we have in society in general, is that we're willing to allow some people to, basically to be treated, human beings I'm talking about, not even marginally things, but rational human beings, we're willing to allow them to be, treated like trash because the goal is to maximize utility, to grow the GNP, and then divide it by the number of citizens, and as long as average utility is high, we live in a great society. I think that's problematic.
I have only partially formed question, and I'm hoping the two of you can maybe help knit together. And it's because there were a couple of ideas that came up that were really appealing to me, and I couldn't quite connect them, and maybe you can help me. At one point, Dan, you were talking about marginal cases, and where we get to the point where it would be unwise to withhold treatment, for example. And you emphasize that negative duties come before positive duties. And we touched on the ethics of care, and Reverend used several times used the term, the care for creation. And where we actually get to that tipping point, saying, no, actually, I have to be good to animals. And it's not just that I don't whack them with a bullhook, but I'm actually thinking about their positive well-being. And whether in Martha's framework or in other frameworks that you've touched on, we hit that tipping point where instead of just not hurting an animal, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to use a chimpanzee in a lethal experiment, where actually at some point my duty becomes positive to him or her, and I'm going to show kindness or gentleness or whatever.
Proactive duty.
Yeah, there might be. We got close there and then didn't quite, our time or the themes of the topics didn't take us there. I wonder if either or both of you have thoughts on that you might share.
Well, just a brief comment back to some of the things I was saying. The responsibility of the hire to be attentive to the needs of the vulnerable, the suffering, the weak. There's a sort of in a sense, a proactive call that we have, it seems to me, to give regard to the vulnerable, kind of coming out of at least my particular theological tradition, and I would say most mainstream traditions. So I think that's. I think the other was at the end when I was talking about a new spirituality, which is just simply an indwelling, a celebration of the beauty and the wonder of creation. So I think both the moral imperative to reach out to the vulnerable and a positive imperative to see creation as gift and to take delight and wonder in it. So that would be my way of coming in.
Good point.
Yeah, I would say so. Rawls admits that it would be unwise to mistreat the marginal cases of humanity. But then if you ask him, why is it unwise to mistreat them, right? He can't say because, he can't bring in rationality because they're not rational, right? There must be some other reason why they're morally considerable, right? Now, if he says that they're morally considerable because they're sentient, right? Then in order to be consistent, he would have to extend the scope of moral concern to non-human animals who are sentient as well. Now, if you try to avoid that conclusion, which, as we all know, that would radically change, right, our moral duties, or how we eat and all that. However, suppose he said this, all human beings deserve respect. And then if you ask, why do all human beings deserve respect? If you said all human beings deserve respect because they're human, that's such a clear begging of the question. That doesn't indicate what it is about human beings, all of them, even the non-rational ones, that makes them worthy of moral respect. And that's what I'm pushing. So let's assume that we think that all human beings deserve moral respect, and then ask the question, why? And you could go the theological route. I don't know that Stephen's going this way and say, well, we are made in the image of God, that they are not. But that strikes philosophers, as involving some criterion that is going to be very hard to rationally prove. All this.
I think this is why Andrew Lindsay takes in this position of theos rights, which is to say that the Creator has a right to respect for creation. That becomes the grounding for him of animal rights and so forth, because there's this larger, more embracing prior right of the Creator to have respect for creation. And so that we, in a sense, coming out of that religious tradition, would want to honor the respect that is due the Creator for the creation. So that would be, I don't know.
Now, Nussbaum, back to the thing about negative duties having a priority over positive duties. Nussbaum agrees to that. She thinks it's been exaggerated historically. So she notices that, tens of thousands of people die every day of starvation-related disease in the world. Now, we get off the hook very often by saying, what? I didn't steal any food from them, right? I'm fulfilling all of my negative duties toward them. So she wants to say, actually, what it means to be moral is not to take the priority of negative duties over positive duties to the point where the positive duties reach the vanishing point, right? And she thinks we have both negative duties and positive duties, but the positive duties, you don't want to just put them on the back burner, right? You have to fulfill them at some point. So.
A question for Reverend Schneider. It's very refreshing to hear about your congregation and what you're doing. Are you seeing, in general, our congregations, and I've read in the paper that this is happening, there was a story in the New York Times on Friday about a Christian congregation in Kentucky that was looking at environmental issues. Do you see this being sort of pushed by the congregation, or do you see the clergy sort of introducing this? I mean, do you have kind of a big picture of what's happening?
Well, and obviously there is a sort of a large scope of interests that range from animal-related interests, non-human animal interests, to environmental interests, to so depending on to things like climate-related. There's a fairly broad set of interests that have been developing across. I see it across multiple religious traditions, the Christian included among them, and so some are pushed, I would say, a little bit more by people whose views around various areas are developed in some area outside their faith community, and they bring it into their faith community and sort of make the connections there. Some things we as clergy may feel particular passion for. So I don't see it as a singular driving force, but I think there is a recognition. I mean, if you go back some years during the time when Earth Day was first instituted, there was a lot of debate between people involved in civil rights and people involved in the beginnings of the environmental movement, who were saying, well, which do we go for? And that became a contentious thing. So I think there's been a sort of a slow, multi-faceted change that has come again through lay persons within faith communities as well as through clergy. So but I think that the fact that there's a widening of interest, I think, is quite clear. I wouldn't say my particular congregation is that different from many. I think what we focus on, animal blessings is one. We picked up on an old tradition within the Anglican Church called rogation days, which were times when the priest would go out in the little parish churches in England and spread water in the fields for the and we sort of moved that into being an understanding of our own expression of Earth Day. So there's I would place animal interests and broader creation interests as part of a larger movement that has multiple initiators.
some of the
This is a follow-up question?
Yeah. What you all waiting for? I was really fascinated by your talks about the veil of ignorance in particular and the society or the universe that will be created by these kind of rational, ignorant actors. But I realized in thinking about that after your talks finished that I spent a lot more time worrying about being the antelope eaten by the lion than I did rejoicing in the possible thrill of being the helicopter hunter with Sarah Palin or something. I guess what I mean is, given that it seems rational to me to focus more energy on concerns about your self-preservation than it would be to rejoice in the power you might have if you were the fortunate human, wouldn't that veil of ignorance experiment possibly lead not just to a kind of more equitable society, but one that's kind of victim-centered or skewed too far to the side of the powerless in a way that creates, vegetarian lions or something like that?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at there. Yeah, well, the whole point to entering the original position behind a veil of ignorance signals a willingness to share each other's fate. Like if you stopped at the threshold of the original position, it might be because you realize if you have some power, you're going to be giving something up, to engage in this sort of rational contract. So that you're right about that. And I think the theological way to put that is in terms of a preferential option for the or that sort of thing. Yeah. However, the whole thing about, and this is something I think is a difficult issue for any animal rightist, the whole issue of the appropriate response to animals in the wild, I think is very, very difficult. Because if you say that animals have rights, then you begin to think about, and this is what the animal rights environmental ethics debate was and still is all about, then you begin to wonder, is it our job to protect the rights of animals who would be killed not at the slaughterhouse, but by, did you say a lion, down an antelope or something, or in this part of the world, cougars, taking down sick deer and so on and so forth. It's a very tough issue. I don't think there's a short way that I can respond to that. I have a real long-winded thing I could say, but I'm not so sure that our efforts in that regard, too aggressive an effort to engage in wildlife management would, our success with respect to wildlife management has not been that hot thus far. So the idea that we would then, take over, it scares me. So, but it seems to me that that's a different issue from the Rawlsian issue. So,
has anyone who has not asked a question who has one? All right, go ahead.
This is a question for Reverend Schneider. We look at spirituality and we look at animals. And what I found meeting people, per se, or don't go to church or so forth, that animals, and I also have a talk show. I'm Animal Addict on KMUD. And in my show, I've learned how to try to reach out to people and try to a commonality. Now, being a spiritual person yourself and animals being such a spiritual element, and to me, animals are spiritual, have you worked for, or have you been able to bridge with a population of people like felons, so forth, bringing that element? Because now in prisons, they are bringing animals, felons or the prisoners are taking care of animals. Are you using that as a connection, a spiritual connection?
Or if you're asking moving outside the sanctuary, to
Well,
what extent am I
Well,
involved with?
let me clarify. No, I'm not
Okay.
being there. People love animals. It doesn't matter who they are.
Absolutely.
So that's a commonality. So
Right.
a prisoner can look at an animal and say, okay, I know that animal loves me. I know there's nothing around it. So
Right.
have you used animal welfare as a therapeutic, bridge?
I can answer that in a couple ways, but the way I just pick out for brevity's sake is I have met on a number of occasions with someone who has no particular faith tradition, explicit institutional tradition, but is a spiritually sensitive person who has experienced the loss of, in one case, several animal companions. And there has been absolutely no difference between the grief they're experiencing and the spiritual meaning of it than were that to be someone in my congregation. And I think so part of my role is to name the significance, to give some language for someone who doesn't have a faith tradition framework, for some beginning words and understandings that name the depth of feeling and attachment and loss and grief. So I guess I would say at the point of pastoral care is where I have mostly moved outside. That I have clergy colleague friends who go into hospital wards, and you're familiar, of course, with those, that kind of what they would see as ministry, but it's done in a very open way so that people are met at the point of the contact that the animal companion has with the person in the hospital. I don't know if that addresses the kind of question you were raising or if you're going some other way.
Well, what I'm saying is that animals, people's love for animals is, for whatever reason, they see the animals as genuine. There's a truth
Yes.
to that relationship
Yes.
with the animal.
Yes.
And because of that, there's a trust. There's, I think, more of an openness. And to me, animals, I am an RN, but
Right.
animal welfare has been a spiritual element for me to guide me in a direction dealing with 10 years of workers' comp,
Great. Okay.
for example.
Can I respond to that? I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've dealt with situations, children that were in the Clarion Institute where they do animal, they have the actual children help train the animals, and they start developing altruistic values where they had not trained before. There's a case about this child, this young woman that was kidnapped, 18 years ago. Now she's doing horse therapy, helping her heal this issue of her abuse, domestic violence. Had a friend bring in dogs into a domestic violence shelter to help the children deal with the separation from their animals and so forth. And I think it's a tremendous role for animals to play in terms of therapy and developing spiritual or altruistic values.
All right, well, I think we have time for one more question. So
Yeah, I want to ask from the perspective of somebody who has to deal with people bringing their animals to a shelter. People like church-going people, people that refuse to spay and neuter their animals because they think, God made them that way, and it's not their job to intervene. But particularly the community that the shelter is in that I volunteer, people that I believe are church-going, and they bring in their animals in the most, disgusting condition that's so upsetting to see how they don't. One woman last weekend drove her ailing 15-year-old Rottweiler to the shelter in the trunk of her car. She shut it in the trunk. And when the worker said to her, you can't do that, you could get in trouble with the police, she said she didn't know she couldn't do that. I don't know how to deal with these things. My first reaction is to be angry, but it doesn't work if you're never going to get through to people. But, if they're religious on one hand, I can't grasp why they behave like this towards animals. I don't know how to...
There really isn't
How can I appeal to them on a more kind of, I guess, theological grounds more than anything else, philosophical?
Well, I think it does come down to the way they see the animal companions they have, and I think that's. I'm not sure that's something that can be changed in that kind of encounter at that point in time. It's distressing and painful to see those kind of encounters, and the fact that people seemingly have identifiable spiritual or religious attachments and continue to do this, I think is reprehensible. It's sad.
They don't see it.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure in that moment that there is necessarily a point of conversion.
No.
One would hope that. I think it's a very difficult and hard thing to see that. And as I tried to indicate, I think there's much tragedy within the Christian tradition that we have been part of, and sometimes that plays out in a whole variety of ways. And the fact that I was lifting up a Franciscan Alternative is not to say that there's been a massive sea change within my own tradition on those questions. I think they're beginnings, they're encouraging, but you still have things like this happen. Just saying.
Well, thank you all for coming. I like to thank.
I think that,